In this video, we're going to assemble your optional fenders on your flash. So the first thing you need to do is identify which is the rear fender, the larger of the two, and the front fender, the smaller fender. Now your fenders may arrive pre-assembled, but if not, the first thing you need to do is attach your spokes here. So there are 4 total spokes. The 2 longer spokes go on the rear fender, the larger fender, and the 2 smaller spokes go on the smaller fender, the front fender. So right here, I've got the 2 smaller spokes going on the smaller front fender.
Now, before we jump into attaching the spokes, we do need to first make sure that these 4 fasteners are attached to your fenders, 2 on either side. You'll need a 3mm Allen key, which is not included with your hardware. There are no holes on the fenders for the fasteners to screw into. Instead, they simply clamp around the lip on both sides of each fender. Just loosen the bolt with your Allen key, enough so that you can slide the clamp over the lip of the fender. Then tighten the bolt down just a bit, enough so that the fastener stays on the fender, but you can still slide it around into position. Once you have all 4 fasteners attached to the fenders, the next step is to position the bottom 2 fasteners at the very bottom end of the fender, just above the mud flap. Once in place, tighten each fastener down with your 3mm Allen key until it's nice and snug. To position the top 2 fasteners, we'll wait until you've already attached the spokes to the bottom fasteners, which we'll do in a second. Then you'll be able to position the top 2 fasteners so that they align with the top of the spokes.
So here I have the 2 smaller spokes, and they're going to attach to the front fender. You'll see on the spokes we have a shorter length here and a longer length. And just as with the rear fender, the longer length of the spoke goes towards the back of the fender where the mud flap is. So these will go just like this, the longer end towards the mud flap and the shorter end towards the front. Okay, so I've got my spoke here. I'm going to put the long end into this hole here towards the mud flap, and the shorter end just goes right in here. And I'm going to tighten these just by turning clockwise, but I'm not going to tighten them all the way, just a teeny bit, really just enough to keep the spoke from falling out, because we're going to adjust that after the fender is on the bike. So again, I'll put the long end towards the mud flap, short end towards the front. Couple of turns clockwise just to keep it from falling out. And now our front fender is assembled and ready to go on the bike. To attach the front fender onto the front fork, the first thing we need to do is slide the fender into place. So we start from behind the front fork, and you can see this plate here. This metal plate needs to be on the front of the fork. So obviously it won't fit through there. So I've opened up the quick release on my front wheel skewer. I lift up the fork, then I can just rotate that through and put the fork back down. And before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and retighten that quick release so I don't forget about that later. Great. So the wheel's back together. The fender is in place. Now we need to attach this front plate to the fork. So here is the bolt assembly for the front fender at the top of the fork. This end is the front, and you see we have a small washer and then a thicker washer. The fork will be right here, and then on the back side of the fork we have one more small washer and then our nut here that tightens on the end. So I'll take the nut off of the end of the bolt here, and I'm going to remove the one smaller washer, and then I'm going to remove the thick concave washer. I'm going to leave one washer on, and I put it through the metal plate. Now I'm going to pass the concave thick washer back through here, making sure that the concave side of the washer is facing the fork, because that's going to fit nice and snugly against the fork once we tighten. So that's all together. Push the bolt all the way through. I'll put the last remaining washer on. Put the nut on the very end of the bolt, and that's all reassembled. Now we can tighten that. To tighten, I need 2 tools. I'll use my 10mm wrench just to hold that nut there from turning, and I'll use a Phillips head screwdriver here to tighten. So at this point, all I'm trying to do is, again, just get it a little bit more than finger tight, because we want to adjust everything before we fully tighten it. And I want to make sure that the thick washer is lined up so it's nice and snug against the frame. So that all looks pretty good. And again, this gives us a little bit of play until we're ready to fully tighten everything. Now we're ready to attach the spokes to the fork. The first thing you need to do is take these bolts out of the fork. This one was finger tight, but if you need a tool to get that out, it's a 4mm hex wrench. So then we just line the spoke up with that hole, put the bolt back in, and just as with the plate on the top of the fork, we're just going to get this finger tight for now until we can get everything in, and then we'll adjust. Okay, I have attached both spokes to the fork, and now we're ready to tighten everything up. The first thing we're going to tighten is the top of the fork, this metal plate here. So again, I'm going to use my 10mm wrench to hold that nut still, and I'm going to tighten with my Phillips head. And as it starts to get tight, I'm going to move this all the way up. I want to keep the fender as high up as it will go. That just keeps it off of the wheel. And we'll get that nice and tight and straight in line. And that one's good. Now we're ready to do the spokes. And as I mentioned before, we use a 4mm hex wrench for those. And we just want to get these nice and tight. Do the other side. Okay, we've got all three of our bolts tightened. The very last thing we need to do is tighten down these spokes. And all you need to do is just turn these little grips clockwise. Get those nice and snug. I'll do the other one here. And you're all set. If you ever need to adjust your fenders, you can just sort of gently move them back and forth. You can loosen these spokes, get them in the better spot, and tighten back up. And we're all set with the front fender. Now we're ready for the rear fender. Before we can put the rear fender on the bike, there's one thing we need to do. We need to attach this metal plate onto this metal plate on the rear fender. I have the black metal plate below the silver metal plate here, and the long end of the black metal plate is closer to the fender. So now I'm ready to screw this in using the small bolt that came in your kit box or with your fenders. So I will just hand tighten this. And that's all we need to do for now, just make sure it's attached. Now that our two metal plates are attached, I can go ahead and just slide this rear fender into place. I'm going to guide these spokes so that they clear the brakes and the derailleur, and we'll leave those right now. The first thing we need to do is attach this metal plate to these eyelets here on the frame. So these bolts come screwed into your frame. These are just finger tight, but if you need a tool, it's a 4mm hex wrench. So I take those off, and now I can just put this black metal plate into position, use my fingers just to get these seated. And unlike all of the other bolts on the fender, these two you can actually tighten down all the way right now. So we'll use our 4mm hex wrench to get these guys tight. And those are on there nice and snug. We'll leave this loose for now until we're ready to do our final adjustment. So the plate is attached to the frame. Now let's move on to the spokes. Just like with the front fender, we're going to pass a bolt through the spokes into these eyelets. But in the case of the rear fender, these bolts do not come attached to your frame. So you'll find these in your kit box or with your fenders when they ship. But I'll just pass one through here, get that seated. Do one on the back side, make sure it's clear of the brake. And I'll tighten with my hex wrench. Okay, I've got the spokes tight, and now I can just crank down on these all the way, get them good and tight. And those are in position. Now we can go back to the plate here and tighten this one up. So just like with the front fender, I'm going to push this all the way up so that it's clear of the rear wheel so we don't rub the wheel. And now I can use my 4mm hex wrench to tighten this guy up. Okay, that one's good and tight. The last step is to tighten these spokes up here. So we twist clockwise, tighten them up. And just as with the front fenders, if you need to adjust these fenders laterally, just loosen these little spoke fasteners, adjust the fender, and then retighten these fasteners. So these are nice and snug. Your fenders are all set, and you're ready to ride.